Termo to Madeline, Audio Edition, Chapter 1, page 21. Van Loen, Tule Lake's first native family. By the late 1870s, the entire western half of the Madeline Plains was called Tule Lake. Matt Haley's Tule Lake Ranch was at Tule Marsh, or Tule Lake proper. But all of the land on the flat and the foothills surrounding it, for 15 miles below the Tule Marsh, was known as Tule Lake. When a person living anywhere in the vicinity registered to vote, his residence was listed as Tule Lake. His mailing address could be anything from Madeline Station at Grasshopper to Reno, Nevada. The person usually only picked up his mail every 6 months to a year. It was to this Tule Lake area, several miles below Tule Marsh, that Elmer Van Loen came in 1877. He was only 19 years old, but was already starting into business for himself. A business which over the years was to expand into one of the finest breeding outfits of purebred Shire draft horses in the country. And as time went along, it expanded into many fields of endeavor besides horses. Elmer Van Loen was a very unique individual among the early Madeline plainsmen. He had all the gentlemanly qualities of George Bailey, and was loved and respected by everyone, hired hands, neighbors, and those whom he did business. Yet he was every bit the innovator that Matt Haley was. Elmer Van Loen was not afraid of new ideas, and when he saw an opportunity, he utilized it to its fullest. He was born in Wisconsin in 1858 and came west to Farmersville, California with his family as a young boy. He grew up there in the fruit-raising country and decided that it was not the life for him. In 1876, he went to Reno, Nevada, where he had an uncle, Barney Clow, who was engaged in livestock raising. He moved in with his uncle and aunt, working for his room and board until he could learn the livestock business. He eventually figured he had learned what he needed to know by the spring of 1877. At that time, he informed his uncle that he was going to move on north. His good uncle gave him the 25 herd of horses and another 25 herd of cattle to provide him with a start in the business. Elmer drove these ahead of him in search of the right place in the meadowland with natural springs that he could take up. Upon his arrival on the Madeline Plains, he filed a piece of ground that was below Daniel McDonald to the west. Here on McDonald Creek, as it was then called, he started his own operation with 160 acres. On it he built a one-room cabin. A pot-bellied stove provided him with heat and a cooking fire. There was a loft upstairs with a straw pallet on which he slept, accessible by a small ladder. On May 23, 1881, he bought Daniel McDonald out, 327 acres for $3,000. Starting at that point, Van Loen worked his way into prominence, and Daniel McDonald went into eternity. Elmer Van Loen not only started a well-known ranch and stage and freighting station at the base of Mount McDonald, he started his family there also. A couple of years after he bought McDonald out, he met a pretty 17-year-old girl in Reno. Lily Sherman and Elmer Van Loen were married soon after. Their first child, a son whom named Dolphus, was born on November 20th, 1884. Dolph was the first native child born on the west side of the Madeline Plains. He was soon followed by two more native sons, Herb and Jesse, and a little sister, Lily. As was often the case in those early years in places like Tule Lake, however, the Van Loen family did not live happily ever after. With all the happiness the pioneers experienced in life, death was always close by to sadden them. Elmer's wife Lily died on June 30th, 1894, in childbirth, as did the new baby. She was only 28 years old. Things had to be extremely difficult for Elmer and his 4 small children over the next 3 years, but then Mr. Van Loan found them a new mother to care for them, and the family's happiness swelled again. On August 8th, 1897, Elmer Van Loan and Ollie Loomis were married in Susanville at the home of William Brockman. By that time, Brockman and Van Loan were neighbors on the Madeline Plains. Death would again knock at the Van Loans' door, however, bringing sadness to everyone. Little Lily had been born with somewhat of a hunchback. As she grew older, it was determined that she had other internal deformities, and she began to fail rapidly. The Van Loans spared no cost in trying to help their little daughter. She was taken to Los Angeles right after the turn of the century, where the latest knowledge in medicine and delicate surgery techniques were to be found. She did improve some after surgery, but continued to have difficulties and eventually passed away at the young age of 27. The only consolation at the time of Lily's passing was that the Van Loans were not completely without daughters. During the years before and just after the turn of the century, 3 daughters, Ruby, Opal, and Dorothy, were born to Elmer and Ollie Van Loan. The Van Loans of the Madeline Plains were a strong family of the sturdiest pioneer heritage. After each setback, they came back the stronger for it. Life was undoubtedly less trying for the notorious bachelors of the Tule Lake, but none of them left a lasting impression like that of Elmer Van Loan family. All right, the next section, titled John Smith, Horseman. Shortly after Matt Haley first came to Tule Lake, the area above toward Clark's Valley began to be taken up by settlers. Robert W. Moore and Charles and Annie Webdell were the first on the scene, but none of them stayed any length of time. Moore filed on 160 acres on Cedar Creek just a mile above the Tule Marsh in 1875. But he sold to James M. Smith in 1879 before he had made the final proof of it. The Webdells filed on a 160-acre homestead on Cedar Creek between Moore and Haley about 1877. They got the patent for their land in 1882, but sold to James Smith, younger brother John Alexander Smith, in 1884. His brother John first came in 1880 and filed on his own 160-acre homestead adjoining the property that James had bought from Moore. It appears that he too did not live there at first, but made his headquarters at South Fork. John Smith was a married man, and a couple of years later he brought his wife Pamela and 4 small children, Art, Mattie, Dora, and John, to the Cedar Creek property to live. Although these first 4 of John's eventual 10 children were not native to Tule Lake, John Smith's family appears to be the first to have made a permanent residence in the area. John Smith was a native of Wayne County, Missouri. He was born there in 1839, but did not come west until after the Civil War, of which he was a veteran. Opportunity drew him west after the war, and he came first to Marysville, California, where he was soon engaged in farming and stock raising. The next 10 years saw John Smith married and ranching in various places throughout the western states, including Bozeman, Montana, and Fort Klamath, Oregon. Lakeview, Oregon, was the last place the family lived before moving to Tule Lake. At Lakeview, John Smith ran a livery stable, and by the time was the owner of a large band of horses. It was with these horses and his first family that he came to Tule Lake. With the sale of the livery stable in Lakeview, he bought out his neighbors, the Webdells, at Tule Lake, and began expanding and improving the property to make it a headquarters for the largest local horse outfit on the western Madeline Plains. A house was built for the family, and barns and corrals for the horses. The range for miles around was wide open, and John Smith was not alone in running his horses on it. Joe Evans and E. A. Harris from Red Rock ran a lot of horses. Some Honey Lakers and the Longs of Horse Lake ran their horses on the plains. Van Loan and Healy and soon John Williams ran their horses there. Many of the livestock outfits of the South Fork Valley brought horses into the Madeline Plains in the summer. Horses from Dry Valley, Grasshopper Valley, and Ash Valley showed up in the Tule Lake area, and John Smith was running 1,500 head of his own at that time. Horses were turned out in the high country in the spring and were mostly left alone until they were needed for something. Haying time saw ranchers out running in horses to pull haying equipment. Sometimes sales were made to stage or freighting outfits which required an early horse rodeo to gather the animals needed to fill a contract. Mostly, though, all the ranchers brought their horses in the fall. Everyone got together for a massive horse rodeo that often took several weeks and covered thousands of acres of rangeland. The South Fork and Tule Lake ranchers generally worked the high country around Boot Lake and Blue Lake with the Red Rock ranchers. At some central point, the majority of the Red Rock stockmen would head home with their animals. A representative or two from the South Fork direction would go with them to pick up any Tule Lake or South Fork horses that were found on the way. The South Forkers and Tule Lakers would head back to Hatter's Flat, taking along a couple of Red Rock representatives. Eventually, at Hatter's Flat, the horses would all be brought together. Any branding that needed to be done would be taken care of. The Red Rock horses would be cut out, and their owners or the owners' representatives would head for the home with them. Hired men would engage over the next several days in driving the brood mares, replacement stock, and saddle and work horses to their wintering grounds in the lower valleys. Others of the hired help would start out for market with the horses that were contracted for sale. For many of the horse raisers in Lassen and Modoc counties, market was in the Sacramento Valley, at Chico, Marysville, or some other such place where good horses were needed. John Smith, on the other hand, always sold his horses on the local market. Of course, the local market could be anywhere from Honey Lake in the south to Lakeview in the north, and well into Nevada in the east. For many years, John Smith was the large supplier of quality saddle and work horses to the market. All right, next section, titled Williams, A Long Family Heritage. John and Mona Williams came to the Madeline Plains from Chico, California in the spring of 1883 with a family of 4 small children, Roy, May, Harvey, and little newborn Eppa. There had been one other boy, Wade, but he had been killed by a runaway wagon before the family ever left Chico. Later, there would be 2 more sons born, George in 1888 and Elmer, named after Elmer Van Loan, in 1897. Actually, the John Williams family was the second family to inhabit the Tule Lake area, coming just a few months before the first native son, Dolph Van Loan, was born. And of all the early families that came to the area, the Williams family stayed the longest. Various descendants of John and Mona Williams had lived on the Madeline Plains up to the time of this writing, almost 100 years later. Actually, John Williams' father, George E. Williams, had first come to the Madeline Plains a couple of years before John did. George came to the South Fork Valley in 1877. A few years later, he had established a place on a small, intermittent stream just a mile east of the marsh place called Crooked Creek. He had also filed on more land just below and adjoining the marsh place to the south. It was to this place that John H. Williams came in 1883 with his family, 100 head of mares, and a top-notch horsebreaker and buckaroo by the name of Ed Pinkston. John was a surveyor by trade, having studied surveying school in Chico and having taught himself more about it on his own as a young man. He maintained a deep interest in engineering all his life. Not so with the livestock business in which he was always involved. He cared very little for ranching and left that up to hired men such as Pinkston and later his sons Roy and Harvey. When they got a little older, John's wife Mona had one driving interest, and that was to get away from people and congested populations such as Chico and the Sacramento Valley. In coming to the Madeline Plains, she must have succeeded beyond her wildest imagination. John probably had a job with Lassen County lined up before he left Chico, because immediately upon the family's arrival on the Madeline Plains, he commenced work as county road overseer for the area, something the Plains had not had up to that time. He was the perfect man for the job, considering he was a surveyor and self-taught engineer. The Madeline Plains had a few wagon trails prior to his coming, but roads were unheard of. Over the next 20 years, it was John Williams' job to survey out the best routes for the continually growing amount of traffic, then building and maintaining them as roads. Many of the roads still used on the Madeline Plains were originally surveyed and mapped out by John Williams. The surveying of the new roads was the road overseer's easiest job. It was building and maintenance that was the most impossible. John was allowed to hire men as county road workers, but was always left short-handed. Another problem that the overseer had, besides a shortage of manpower, was a shortage of equipment. Generally speaking, whatever equipment and horses the overseer personally owned was what he had to work with. John Williams had a good many miles of road to build and maintain with a team and wagon and a pick and a shovel. Sometimes a Fresno scraper was used in the worst places to divert water away from the roads. More common, though, was a double tree with a set of single trees and a chain for dragging off rocks. John Williams and his various county men spent hundreds of hours dragging off rocks in this manner. To get them out of the middle of the road, they would first be dug around and then loosened with a pick or a crowbar. When the chain was fastened around the rock, it would be fastened to the clasp of the double tree. The driver would speak to the horses, and they would drag the rock up out of the ground and to the side of the road. Hour after hour, time after time, this process would go on. If the crew was large enough, one man would be occupied loosening the big rocks, another would drag them off with a team of horses, and a third man would come along behind, filling the holes with dirt and little rocks. All three men would also spend countless hours throwing little rocks off the road. One place, sloping to the side, a great deal of time would be spent in building a rock retainer wall on the downhill side, then leveling off the interior with small rocks and dirt. And as more and more freighters came through the area, it was necessary to straighten out any sharp turns to accommodate the long lines of horses pulling freight wagons. On the flat, about the only thing that could be done was to fill the ruts with a shovel or scraper after a wet spell. There were always miles and miles of ruts scarring the road's surface after heavy rains or a spring thaw. Besides all the miles of roads that he built, John Williams surveyed and built dams, ditches, and reservoirs all over the country for various ranchers and water promoters, and Mona was a midwife and general practitioner in home remedies and medicines. During the next 35 years, she brought a large number of babies into the world and cured many an ache and pain for her neighbors. All in all, John and Mona Williams left a very lasting heritage on the Madeline Plains for their descendants. Next section, Death of a Chinaman. In the spring of 1883, a certain Chinaman was living in Alturas. This fellow was not only of Chinese ancestry, which was looked upon with a certain amount of prejudice in the West in those years, but he had also developed a serious disease. Most people thought it was leprosy, and it was not long before the Chinaman was ran out of town. He made his way to South Fork Valley, but was only there for 3 days before being sent on his way again. He had spent at least one night at the home of August Moberg. There he had tried to buy his way into Moberg's confidence by offering him a purse full of gold pieces. Moberg, fearing the disease, refused the money and sent him on his way. Several people came into contact with this Chinaman while he was there and saw the money he had to offer. One of these people was a flashy-dressed Indian who was accused of wearing high-heeled riding boots and a large felt hat with a feather in the hat band. It was only natural that these trails of his particular Indian and the Chinaman would later cross. The Indian had seen the gold and had heard the settlers talk of how the Chinaman was a menace to society. When the Chinaman left South Fork and headed out into the Madeline Plains, the Indian was not far behind. The unfortunate Chinaman was overtaken at Madeline Creek. There the Indian murdered him and robbed him of his money, disappearing silently into the vast expanse of uninhabited territory on the plains. Later that summer, the skeleton was found by a bunch of buckaroos. The coyotes had been active in scattering the bones, but there was enough pieces of the clothing to positively identify the remains of that of the Chinaman. Wade Williams, the 19-year-old son of George E. Williams, was with that group of cowboys. He located the skull and placed it on a large lower limb of a juniper tree. There it was to remain for many years, a silent testimony to the wild and woolly ways of the Madeline Plains.